morning. Today we are working on settling the West still. Only we are going to be looking at settling the West from the perspective of the Native Americans. So the settlement of the West dramatically altered the way of life of the Plains Indians. A lot of those nomadic groups had followed buffalo migrations for their main source of food. So they were pretty much nomadic groups without permanent settlements. And what would happen is whenever a lot of these like white settlers would move in, they would start hunting the buffalo as well. And that would deplete their buffalo population and kind of almost ruined their way of life. So we'll talk more about that in a second. So a lot of the Plains Indians were similar, even though they were like nomadic small groups. They were divided into bands that were made up of about 500 people for each group. They had a governing council headed each band. Most of the members of each band participated in making decisions. Most of them lived in extended family groups, and most of them believed in the spiritual power of the natural world. So some of the Plains Indians, like a depiction of them hunting buffalo. This is like a wax kind of museum something we would see in a wax museum. So the first major clash, because a lot of the topics in this chapter will deal with skirmishes that happened between the white settlers and the Native Americans. But the first major clash begins in 1862 with the Dakota Sioux. So the Dakota people launched a major uprising in Minnesota. The Sioux had agreed to live on a reservation in exchange for annuities, but they never got any of the annuities. So by 1862, a lot of them had lived in poverty and were, starving and didn't really have any of the resources that they were promised. They, were in a really tough position. So Chief Little Crow asked local traders to provide food on credit because he's like, we don't have any money. We don't have any means of making money. We don't have any resources. We're starving and, we don't really have any other way to do this. And so one of the local traders replied, if they're hungry, let them eat grass on their own dung. So 2 weeks later, that trader was found dead with his mouth stuffed with grass. So obviously sending a sign. So Little Crow agreed to and led the uprising. He didn't want to at first because he didn't want to kill innocent people. But he eventually agrees, like, yes, this needs to happen. He wanted to wage war against soldiers, though, not the civilians. So once the fighting started, he couldn't stop the angry Dakota from slaughtering hundreds of settlers in the area. And so there are a lot of other innocents who were killed in this skirmish as well. After the rebellion was suppressed, a military tribunal sentenced 307 Dakota to death. So after reviewing the evidence, President Lincoln reduced the number to 38 instead of 307. Others had fled the reservation when federal troops arrived and became exiles in a region that bore their name, which is known as the Dakota Territory. So on your map, we know the Dakota Territory is North and South Dakota, but this is where your Dakota Sioux tribe lived in exile after their first territory was taken from them. So the Dakota Territory was home to another Sioux tribe known as the Lakota. So you have the Dakota and you have the Lakota. So the Lakota were also nomadic, and they had fought hard to keep control of their hunting grounds from the Black Hills to the Bighorn Mountains in the Dakota Territory. They had several different chiefs: Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and Sitting Bull. Some of y'all have probably heard of Sitting Bull. But we're going to talk a little bit about Red Cloud's War. It went on from 1866 to 1868, so this is right after the Civil War. So the Army was constructing forts along the Bozeman Trail, and then Crazy Horse had tricked the fort's commander into sending Captain William Fetterman and about 80 soldiers out to pursue what they thought was a small raiding party. So they basically set out and, set up a small group and made it look like they just had a small group of people who were coming to fight. And so Fetterman and his 80 soldiers come out and they're like, we'll squash this skirmish, before anything could happen. All of a sudden, hundreds of warriors come out and ambush the soldiers and wipe out their entire unit. So the Sioux continued to resist military presence in the region, and in 1868, the army had finally abandoned its post along that trail because they were tired of having to fight the Lakota continuously for it. So. And this is an image depicting Red Cloud's War in the Dakota Territory. So Sand Creek is another situation that we talk about in Native American history. In the 1860s, tensions had begun to rise between the miners coming into Colorado in search of silver and gold and the Cheyenne and Arapaho who had already lived there. So as the number of settlers started increasing, obviously, Native Americans start raiding wagon trains. They start stealing cattle and horses from ranches. Like, they're doing anything they can to, like, get them to leave. So by 1864, trade had come to a standstill, and dozens of homes had been burned, and an estimated 200 settlers had been killed. So Territorial Governor John Evans ordered the Native Americans to surrender at Fort Leon, where he said they would be given food and protection, or else they were going to attack them. So a lot of them surrendered at the fort, but obviously others did not. Some others still were willing to fight for their cause. So in November 1864, Chief Black Kettle brought several hundred of the Cheyenne to the fort to negotiate a peace deal because he, was agreeable and thought, this might be the best way to settle this instead of continuously fighting and violence and so on. Like, we can just negotiate some sort of deal. The fort's commander didn't have the authority to negotiate and told Black Kettle to take his men to Sand Creek while he waited for orders. So what they did was Colonel John Chivington of the Colorado Volunteers was ordered to attack the Cheyenne at Sand Creek. Instead of negotiate with them, they just send a colonel and his men to attack them. So when Chivington stopped at Fort Leon, he was told that Native Americans at Sand Creek were waiting to negotiate. Chivington replied that there could be no peace. And so 14 soldiers died and 148 Native Americans were killed in this massacre. We call it a massacre because over 100 people had died, One general called Chivington's attack the foulest and most unjustifiable crime in the annals of America. So instead of negotiating, he says, there is no peace. We're not willing to negotiate. We will just kill them. And so this is a monument that is in memory of the Native Americans who lost their lives at Sand Creek. This is what they get. Over, 150 people die, but, we'll just put this memorial up and that'll be okay. That'll be great. Everything will be fine. So in 1867, Congress formed the Indian Peace Commission, which proposed creating 2 large reservations on the plains for the Sioux and for the Native Americans in the Southern Plains. So agents from the federal government's Bureau of Indian Affairs would run the reservations, and the Army would then deal with any groups that refused to report or remain there. So reservations were based exclusively on keeping the Native Americans separate from American citizens to minimize conflict. They obviously couldn't get along, so it's like we'll just take all these Indians and we'll put them on a reservation, and they'll just have this reservation land, and they can just be separate, and it's fine. So the Indian Peace Commission plan was deemed a failure. Pressuring Native American leaders into signing treaties did not ensure that chiefs or their followers would abide by them, nor could they prevent settlers from violating their terms. So those who did move on the reservations faced poverty and despair and the corrupt practices of American traders because they weren't able to hunt their buffalo. Like, they literally were a nomadic group. They weren't used to settling in one particular area. They also didn't know how to plant like crops. They didn't know how to, they didn't domesticate animals. That wasn't how they lived. And so taking them from their nomadic lifestyle and trying to make them settle in one particular area without their main source of like food and resources, the buffalo, is, dooming them for failure. So by the 1870s, many Native Americans on the Southern Plains had left the reservations in disgust. A lot of them preferred hunting buffalo on the open plains. They were tired of trying to live on the reservations. Buffalo were constantly disappearing because the settlers were killing them off like by the thousands. A lot of them were like taking the buffalo just for their hides and then leaving all the meat and stuff and selling them to selling the hides in markets in the east. And that was obviously like atrocious to the Native Americans because they, believed in a spiritual thing. Like you want to use all of the buffalo. You don't want to leave any behind. You don't want to upset Mother Nature. Like you value the life of the buffalo, even though you've had to kill it. You're going to use every piece of it and honor the buffalo in that sense. While meanwhile, the white people are just coming in and just like killing the buffalo, taking their hides, selling them out east. And a lot of hunters were like killing them for sport, and they would just leave the carcasses to rot. Railroad companies even hired sharpshooters to kill large numbers of buffalo because they were like obstructing the railroad traffic, and then they like used the buffalo to feed to workers. The Army encouraged buffalo killing because they knew that would be a way to stop the Native Americans from wanting to like thrive in those areas and continue to be a nomadic group. So by 1889, very few of the animals remained, and the Native Americans like find themselves in a really tough situation because they are without one of their greatest commodities. So in 1876, prospectors overran the Lakota Sioux Reservation in the Dakota Territory to mine gold in the Black Hills. So the Lakota who had fought the Army to stay out of their territory are overran by prospectors because they found gold in the Black Hills. So the Lakota saw no reason that they should abide by that treaty that the American settlers were violating. So they left the reservation and that spring, and they went to hunt near the Bighorn Mountains in southeastern Montana. The government sent an expedition commanded by General Alfred H. Terry and Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, someone that you've probably heard of, in the 7th Cavalry. They were with the expedition. Custer underestimated the fighting power of the Lakota and the Cheyenne and launched an attack on one of the largest groups of Native American warriors ever assembled on the Great Plains. The Native Americans killed Custer and all of his men because he like literally thought he was going to be big and bad and just go in and like attack all these Native Americans. So the newspaper accounts have portrayed Custer as a victim of a massacre, when in all actuality, he was coming in to like kill all of them. It's like he attacked them first, whatever. So Sitting Bull flees to Canada after this, and the other Lakota were forced to return to the reservation and give up the Black Hills. So it really puts the Lakota in a really tough situation because now they're forced to have to like abide by these reservation laws and stay on their reservations. And Sitting Bull has had to flee because if he didn't, he would have been either killed or arrested or who knows what. I'm sure they probably would have killed him, honestly. Here's another depiction of the Battle of Little Bighorn. But we also have to talk about the flight of Nez Perce because this is another really sad situation. So Chief Joseph led the Nez Perce people 1,300 miles when they refused to be moved to a smaller reservation in Idaho in 1877. So he's like, okay, we're not going to go to this small reservation. We'll go further west. We'll get out of the way. So in October, Joseph surrendered and said that his followers were exiled to Oklahoma. They didn't really have any other choice. He said, our chiefs are killed. The little children are freezing to death. My people have no blankets, no food. Hear me, my chiefs. I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever. And so the Native American resistance comes to a final and tragic end on the Lakota Sioux Reservation in 1890. So, defying the orders of government, the Lakota had continued to perform the ghost dance, which they would, it was a ritual that celebrated a hoped-for day of reckoning when settlers would disappear, the buffalo would return, Native Americans would reunite with their dead ancestors. Like, it's just a happy ritual that they continue to practice, even though the white people have told them to stop. So federal authorities had banned the ceremony, fearing it would lead to violence, and they blamed Chief Sitting Bull, who had just gotten back from Canada, for this particular ceremony. Sitting Bull supporters tried to stop the arrest, but the chief himself was killed. So a group of ghost dancers then fled the reservation, and the army went after them, ending in 25 soldiers being killed and 200 Lakota men, women, and children being killed. And so Wounded Knee was a very tragic event that should have never happened. All they were doing was a ghost dance, like all of it, just a ghost dance. But they didn't trust the Native Americans. There's a lot of skepticism with their rituals, and so it turned into a massacre, essentially. So in 1897, this is where the United States really sucks. Some Americans had opposed the treatment of Native Americans. Like, one solution was to assimilate them into American society as landowners and citizens. Divide up the reservations, give people land. Let's give them land, and they would, each head of household to get 160 acres to farm. Single adults would get 80 acres, and 40 were allotted to children. So the remaining land would be sold to American settlers, with proceeds going to a trust for Native Americans. Obviously, this is not going to work out well because the Native Americans are used to being nomadic. They don't know how to farm 160 acres of land. So the plan failed to achieve any of its goals. Some Native Americans succeeded as farmers or ranchers, but a lot of them just sold their allotments and then took the money and went on. No legislation could provide a satisfactory solution for the Native American issue because there was no entirely satisfactory solution to be had. It was their land to begin with, and white people were continuously taking it from them. So the Native Americans were dependent on the buffalo for food, clothing, fuel, and even shelter. When the herds were wiped out, Native Americans on the plains couldn't sustain their way of life that they had known for years and years and years. So part of the Dawes Act called for Native Americans to undergo a 25-year period to establish their competency to become U.S. citizens. They have freaking lived on the continent for their entire lives. They've been there longer than the Americans, like the English, the white people had been there. But they needed to go through a 25-year period to establish their competency to become citizens. Not until 1924 did Congress pass the Citizenship Act, granting all Native American citizenship. Some states didn't grant Native Americans the right to vote until after World War II. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal ended the Dawes Act in 1934 and gave Native American tribes control over some of their restored reservation lands to elect tribal governments and kind of live on their own once again. Even today, we still have a lot of issues with the Native Americans. It's just a history of terrible atrocities that Americans have committed over time. But we'll talk more about this as history moves on. The next chapter, we're going to start talking about industrialization, and we'll talk about how horrible we treated the Chinese. So, I'm going to try my best to point out the good things America has done, that Americans have done, as well as the bad things, because it's all a part of history. We need to learn from mistakes so that we don't repeat them. Anyway, hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Email if you have any questions. Let me know if you need anything. See you guys.